So, this morning we are finishing the Sermon on the Mount. And, I remember saying like 10 plus months ago that I was looking at the Sermon on the Mount with a lot of anticipation, a lot of, looking forward to, man, this is like the time that I will preach through the Sermon on the Mount and just what it is to preach through really this giant message that Jesus gave for his kingdom and his rule and just everything that it entailed. But I can't tell you what it was like to go through it. It far exceeded my expectations of being, just listening to the teaching of Jesus and just understanding it. And I think even for like 2 years now, we've been on the teaching of Jesus. Whether it's been on parables or other things, we've been on the teaching of Jesus for almost 2 years. And to be coming to the end of this, I just think it's probably not nearly as extreme, but I think of the two that were walking on the road to Emmaus. And the risen Lord Jesus Christ was walking with them, and they didn't know it was him. But he was talking to them, and afterwards it says in Luke 24:32, it says that they said to one another, they said, "Did our hearts not burn within us while he spoke to us on the road?" And they said that they could just feel just the presence of him being there. And they said, while he opened to us the scriptures. And I'm sure it would be much more impactful to be walking with the Lord as he spoke to you. But I just think as we come to the end of this, I just think, man, I feel like I don't want to leave the presence of the teaching of Jesus Christ because it has been so good and I've enjoyed it so much. And I hope that you've just enjoyed just being in the teaching of Jesus and hearing it and just being, just learning what he teaches us and what he says to us as our Lord. I hope it's been a special thing to you. So this week, we're looking at putting into practice the Sermon on the Mount. And, I have a little disclaimer this morning, and I've had this many times, but that is that, you may hear this message and you may say, what are you teaching? Are you teaching a works-based salvation? Are you teaching that you're saved by doing good things? And I'm absolutely not. That's not my goal. Salvation is a gift from God. It is a gift through Jesus Christ that we did not deserve, we cannot earn, and we cannot be good enough to be given this gift. However, if you think back on the teachings of Jesus, every single teaching that I can think of says salvation changes you and transforms your life. Every lesson I can think of that we've gone through, whether it's the talents, and he says, you've been given these gifts and these talents, and what do you do with them? What do you do with the talents I gave you? Or whether it's the faithful and wise servant. He says, I have set you in charge of a household. And on my return, will you have been faithful or unfaithful? And he says, the unfaithful, he cuts in pieces and puts them in with the hypocrites. And I think, wow, Jesus teaches, putting you in charge and that you would have faithfulness to things. And whether it's the 10 virgins that we looked at the parable. And Jesus says, which ones of them got ready? Half of them had the door shut in their face. They did not prepare themselves. They did not act upon and prepare themselves for the Lord's return. They did not do that. And I think of what about the seed and the sower? He says, what happens? He says, the seed that lands and what? Grows. That changes, that it produces what it was meant to be. This is the one. What about the yeast in the bread? The salvation that enters and what happens? Transformation. It changes the one it enters. What about there's so many others. What about the mustard seed? The seed that starts so small and transforms and grows into a giant thing. Every teaching that we've looked at of Jesus that I can think of, and there's so many more. We just looked at the Sermon on the Mount that was so based on all of these things. The teaching of Jesus teaches that salvation enters and changes who you are. That's how Jesus teaches, and that's the way he teaches. He teaches that he entrusts to us something that was supposed to change our lives. And that's just the way it is, and that's the way I'm teaching it, and that's why it sounds that way. So as we look at this, we're in Matthew 7, verse 24. And it says, then everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. Now, I know we've heard this so many times, and we've heard the stories in Sunday school, and they say, so build your life on the Lord Jesus Christ, right? And they say, so build your life on Jesus. But I would like to say that based on the context of what Jesus is talking about, don't get me wrong. Building your life on Jesus Christ is about the best truth anyone could say. I'm not saying there's something wrong with it, but I don't think that's exactly the context of exactly how he's using this verse. If we were to look at the context to make sure we understood what he just said, if we were to go up a little bit, what he just talked about was being on the straight and narrow path. He says, are you entering through the narrow gate? Are you walking with me? Are you really walking with me? Have you denied the flesh, picked up your cross, and followed me? Have you done it? Have you just heard or claimed, or have you actually walked by my side? Have you done it, is what he's talking about. Did you walk with me? Did you walk the straight and narrow? And he talks about that for a while. And he says, you need to make sure that you're on the right path and not the broad path, living however you want. And then just a little bit further down, he talked about good or bad fruit. And he says, listen, by their fruit you will know them. He says, did they live according to my teaching? He says, if they're bringing forth thorns and thistles, you're going to know that they're false. He says, they're not my people if they're not bringing forth the right thing. He says, by their fruit you will know them. Then the very last thing he says before he gives this statement about building on the rock, he says this. He says in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the ones who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. He says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? He says, did we not do many, many works in your name? And so Jesus is saying there's going to be a lot of people who are making claims that they are following the Lord. They're going to be saying, Lord, 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 but they never really actually took his teaching and made any application to it. He says that there's a lot of people who are going to do that. And he says many people, and I want to point out the fact that he says many twice. He says many will enter the broad gate, thinking they're on the right path, but they're living in the wide and easy way. Many people are going to go through the wrong way in life. And then he says many of them will stand before me and say, Lord, aren't you my Lord? Where did we go wrong? Like he says, many in both cases. There's a vast majority of people who are going to be misunderstood on Judgment Day. They're going to misunderstand because they weren't actually, there was no growth. Jesus teaches growth. He teaches change. He teaches transformation through all of his teaching. And these people will stand before him without growth, change, and transformation. And it says, and then Jesus says to them, and I just want to point out too, how do we know that we know the Lord? What is the evidence that we look for? Is it that we can cast out demons? Is it that we can do special things that people see? In 1 John 2:3, he says it very plainly. He says, by this you may know that you've come to know me, if you keep my commandments. And anyone who says that he knows me but does not keep my commandments is a liar. That's kind of straight shooting, right? He says, this is how you know the Lord. When your life is showing it, when it's producing it, when you're living in the teaching of Jesus, then you'll know that you know him and he knows you, that you're walking with him. And then Jesus says, this is the last thing he says before he makes this statement about building on the rock. Jesus says this in verse 23, then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. He says, I will tell them the bad news. Get out. You did not obey me, you people who live in disobedience. That is the last thing he says before this statement. So then, now, listen to this statement one more time, okay? He says, then, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. It's a little bit different than the way that maybe I've heard it so many times. It sounds a little bit different than people saying, so build your life on Jesus Christ, like trust him. Jesus says, so build your life on what I just told you to do. That's what he said. He said, so everyone who hears these words of mine and obeys them is somebody who's building on a solid foundation. They probably didn't look at Jesus as, oh, you're the rock. They probably looked at Jesus and Jesus was just teaching them. And he said, see the sand over here? It's washy. and it's going to wash out. You build over there, you're gone. You build up here on the rock, up out of the desert, it's a good foundation. He says, I just taught you the good foundation. He says, I just gave you the teachings of how to build it right and solid. And I just think I want you to recognize a little bit that this is where he's going with this. That he's saying, listen, I just gave you the teachings of how to build it. And that is what you need to listen to, is how to build it. And then he says here, so as we look at this, he says in verse 24, he says, then everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And then he says, and the rains fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, but it did not fall because it was founded on the rock. He says that people who heard his teaching and listened to it and made application are going to withstand the weathers. They're going to withstand what happens to them. They're going to withstand, essentially, I believe, they're going to withstand on Judgment Day because they made application to what Jesus says. And, I want to point out why I think this is because Jesus says in the beginning of this, so then anyone. He says, what does that mean? So then anyone. It means according to what I just told you. What did he just tell them? He says, I will say to many people on Judgment Day, get out, you never made application. He says, get out, you practice lawlessness. He says, so then, anyone who builds on the teachings I give them will build a solid foundation. He says, this is what I'm talking about. He says, I'm talking about building on my teaching. He says, I'm talking about making application, about transforming your life based on what I just told you to do. And so he says here in verse 28, here in verse 27, it says, actually I skipped verse 26 as well. I'm all over in my notes here. I'm sorry. He says here in verse 25, he says, that the rains will fall and the floods will come, and he says that they'll be solid because they're founded on the rock. And then he says in verse 26, he says, these are the people who didn't apply my teaching. He says in verse 26, he says, then everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish person who built his house upon the sand. And he says that the rains will come, and he says the floods will rise, and the wind will beat against that house, and it will fall. And he says, and great will be its fall. And he says, so not only is the house that they built going to fall, but he says, great will be its fall. Why does he have to expound upon it? Isn't it bad enough that somebody builds a house and the house collapses in the rain? Isn't that bad? But he says, great will be its fall. He says it's going to be an epic collapse. Why does he say it's going to be an epic collapse? Why does he say it's going to be this, like it is going to be a massive fall? And I believe it's because they're going to stand there and they're going to hear, depart, I never knew you, you who never made application of what I told you to do. That is an epic fall. That is something horrible. That is what they're going to hear because he says, listen, I just told you that I will send out the ones who did not make application. And then he says, those who try to build their life without application will have a fall that will not only be a collapse, but it will be an epic collapse. And I think he's saying something horrible, that they will realize that they never transformed like all of Jesus' teaching says you will do. All of Jesus' teaching says you will change, it will change you, it will change you, it will transform you, you will be different. But he says those who live their life however they want are going to collapse in an epic way. And I think that this is what he's getting at here. And so then in verse 28, he says, when Jesus finished these teachings, he says that the crowds that were there were astonished at his teaching because he was teaching them as someone who had authority and not as their scribes taught. When Jesus got done, they were a little bit jaw-dropped. They said, wow, this guy teaches with some authority. This guy says, if you don't listen to me, you are going to die in a bad way. This guy teaches different than anyone I've ever heard before. They said, this is different. He's saying, I have extreme authority, and they were kind of jaw-dropped by what he said. This is how Jesus ends his Sermon on the Mount. It says that they heard it, and it was like, this guy is somebody powerful who's saying a very, very powerful message. And so I just want to think about this, the fact that he says, I am the Lord. He says, these are my teachings, and I've said it a million times, and I'll say it once more, that I do believe that salvation is a matter of the heart. He addressing the heart issues. Salvation is a matter of faith. Salvation is a matter of believing. But also Jesus is saying, I am the Lord, listen to me. I am telling you how to transform your life and bring forth the fruit that shows your salvation. He says, I just laid it out for you carefully. And he says, anyone who heard what I just taught, anyone who paid attention to the Sermon on the Mount, he says, these words of mine that I said, and builds with them will withstand the floods. They will not be washed away in an epic collapse. And so as I just think about this and in closing and wrapping up the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount, what do I want to remember it as? What do I want to look back and say, these are the teachings that Jesus said to build with? And I picked out just a list of 7 random things from beginning to end. And this may not be the perfect choices, but these are what stood out to me. So number 7, I would say, if I could wrap up the attitude of the Beatitudes. Jesus starts with the attitude of those who will inherit the kingdom of heaven, those who will inherit the earth, those who will be called the sons and daughters of God, those who have the attitude who are entering his kingdom. And if I could sum it all up, it would be the poor in spirit, the weak, the meek, the humble, the ones who come to him that are mourning their sin. Those are the people. So if I could wrap up all the Beatitudes into saying, have the attitude necessary. As James said, he said, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And he said, cleanse your hands, you sinners. And he says, purify your hearts, you double-minded. He says, mourn, be wretched and mourn, and let your sorrow be turned to, or let your joy be turned to sorrow, and let your laughter be turned to mourning. And he says, humble yourself before the Lord and he will exalt you. So first off, I would say, have the attitude. The Beatitude attitudes. Jesus taught an attitude. He says, if you will humble yourself before God like this, he will exalt you. So he gave us the attitude to have. Then number 6, don't take sin as a small thing. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. He says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. He says, it's better that you enter heaven, or he says, it's better that you live maimed than you have your whole body cast into hell. He says, don't make sin a small thing. He says, be serious about right and wrong. He says, be very, very serious about right and wrong. Number 5, I would choose forgiveness. Man, does Jesus talk a lot about forgiveness. He says, if you want forgiveness, give forgiveness. He says, if you'll not forgive others, neither I forgive you. And this reminds me of another teaching of Jesus, the unforgiving servant. He says, listen, you came to me for forgiveness, and I forgave you. Should not you have known that you should have forgiven your fellow brother? And he said that he will be in prison until he's paid every last cent. And he says, so my heavenly Father will do to every one of you who does not forgive his brother from the heart. This is a transformation, a producing of the fruit of the teachings of Jesus that he wants to come out of you. Jesus spent a lot of time on forgiveness. And I put that, it would be just number 5 in my list. Number 4 would be prayer. He spent a lot of time on prayer, a real relationship talking to Jesus, a real relationship of serious that you communicate with your Lord. He says, be very serious in prayer. Number 3, I chose serving 2 masters, being double-minded, that you pursue money, you pursue people noticing you, you do your works to be seen by others, no matter what you do and how you live. Are you doing it because of you and you're serving 2 masters, that you're serving God and money? He says, you cannot serve 2 masters. He says you must make one choice of the 2, and you must serve God and God alone. And that is what I chose as my 3rd choice. And the second to last one that I chose would be to trust God. He says that you must trust me. He says, don't worry, don't sweat, don't let things bother you, but have faith in God. Trust him, walk with him, trusting with him. And lastly, the last one that I chose would be to love them. He says, love them. Love them, love them, love them. He says, do unto others as you would wish them to do unto you. He says, I want you to love them. I want you to forgive them. I want you to care about them. I want you to see people and care about them and love them. And he says, I want you to have this within you. And it reminds me of another teaching of Jesus that he says, on Judgment Day, he will separate the people. And he will say, as much as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. He says, I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no bread. He says, I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. I was sick and in prison and you did not visit me. And he says, as much as you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it to me. And he says, as much as you've done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. And he says that he is looking for this transformation in your life. He says, love one another. He says, love them, forgive them, care about them. This is a must that he's looking for as a transformation based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. These are things he's looking to come out of your life if you say that Jesus Christ has come into your life. So in closing this morning, I do feel like I've been a little bit of a mess this morning. I don't know why that sometimes happens to me. I just get all sloppy in my notes, and it could be because I just didn't know how to close out this great message. I didn't know how to make this huge point of this necessity of application to everything that Jesus said. I didn't know how to wrap this all up and say, Jesus says, make application of everything, and I got a little bit wishy-washy in all of it, and this is my final closing notes, and of course I'm not going to get through all this, but if you can see it, I have printed and reprinted and typed and retyped and penciled in every inch of space with things that I wish I could say to you in closing this morning, and I'm not going to be able to say it all to you. There's no way I can cover all this, and there's no way, I'm just going to try and wrap this up, but this is what I want to close this out with this thought, and that is that salvation is a free gift from God. It is a free gift from him, and he does teach transformation, and he does teach change. He does teach that you ought to be producing the things that Jesus told you to do. He said, do this. He said, do my teaching. He gave us these teachings, and he says they had better, it's almost to the point that if they're not there, I would say it is to the point. If his teachings are not in your life, then you don't know him. Like he's saying, Jesus straight up teaches a message of transformation. Jesus teaches a message of change. Though it is a free gift, he teaches a message of change. And so with that, understanding the free gift, the change that he says this will happen, and this is the thought I want to leave you with, is I've seen so many people in my life, and I thought, man, their life is a disaster. And I thought, they need Jesus. They need Jesus. And then I seen these people, and they supposedly found Jesus. And I thought, why is their life still a mess? Doesn't Jesus change people? Don't we say they need to find Jesus? Why? Because they change people. Jesus changes people. And I think this is my thought, is that I've come to think they don't just need Jesus. They need to apply Jesus. They need to find Jesus and listen to what he said, because Jesus intends for us to obey what he taught. And I think I struggle with this idea of, no, I don't want to have anything that I count on of my own good works to get me to heaven. Never do I want that. Never, right? I do not want a self-righteousness, do I? But I think of the story of the man who was drowning. This goes good with the floods rising, right? With this build your house on the rock. And so I think I've heard this story of this man, and he's standing on his rooftop, and the floods are coming up, and a boat comes along, and he says, no, God's going to save me. And the water gets up, to his chest. He says, no, the second boat comes by. No, God's going to save me. And the last boat comes by, and the water's up to his nose. He says, God's going to save me. And the water goes over his head, and he drowns. And he gets to heaven. He says, God, you were supposed to save me. And God says, I keep sending boats, Part of me says, Jesus says, I'm offering you my hand, and I'm saying, come out of that sinful life. I'm saying I'm here. Obey me and follow me and walk by my side and obey my teachings and follow me and walk the path with me. Come out and walk with me, and I'll give you my strength, and you live with me and live how I say and obey my teachings, and you will follow me and we'll enter that kingdom. And we say, but Lord, I'm just waiting because I don't want to do anything good of my own. And he's saying, but I'm sending you boats. I think a little bit of that applies to the teaching of Jesus, because how can Jesus teach that salvation enters and you live different? You change. You obey what he told you in the Sermon on the Mount. You follow the teaching of Jesus if you are a child of Jesus. By this you may know that you've come to know him. Like, if that's how he teaches, he must be sending us boats, right? He must be offering us strength, right? He says he does. He does. And if you want your life to change, you need to accept the strength that he's offering, and you need to be like, here I come, Lord, I'm coming, I'm listening, and I'm following the teachings you're telling me. I'm going to walk by your side. And that's what he ends this great sermon with, is, listen, you guys heard the sermon, right? You heard these words of mine. Take them and build with them. Build your life on the teachings that I just taught. Build your life on the Sermon on the Mount, and the rains will come, and the winds will blow, the floods will rise, and you will withstand the storm because you have built your life upon the teachings I just told you. And so I just hope that we just understand that that's what he wants from us. And man alive, for how long I had and how quick I was going to wrap up that one little page, it's a good thing I didn't try and wrap it all up. But anyway, we will, let me just close in a word of prayer this morning.